First question, do politicians actually, when they swear an oath, do they actually have to read the Australian Constitution first before they actually swear? If not, why not? Secondly, we have a lot of politicians who are obsessed with putting China, America and other countries first rather than Australia. Do they actually have an obligation to put Australia first, or is that coincidental? And thirdly, regarding after the elections, with the causes you were mentioning earlier, let's say Wollongong, what proportion of our politicians have studied science beyond year 10? And the reason I'm asking that is because since a lot of our politicians, including, for example, Michael Phelps, I think his name is.
Peter
Phelps, sorry. He had a PhD in history, so there's obviously no appreciation for the technical aspect of what's involved. So in that regards, is that actually, are the politicians in Canberra representing a true glimpse of snapshot of the Australian demographic, or is it a very narrow sort of snapshot?
You know, classically, most of our politicians have law degrees and they come from a very narrow band of the community. And that's been one of the interesting things with some of the minor parties, that's changed a bit. And it's been a great privilege to represent the Greens, coming from a different sort of background myself. So I definitely agree that there should be a broader cross-section of people that representing us in Parliament, and that there's far too much focus on global economics and that kind of neoliberal corporate freedom that's at the expense of, you know, we've seen the manufacturing industry in Australia destroyed, and there's been all sorts of other factors, macroeconomic factors like the mining boom and the strong Aussie dollar, but having a greater focus on investment within the country, I think would definitely be a good thing. And then the first part of your question was
reading the Constitution.
Reading the Constitution. Having failed to become a parliamentarian so far, I'm not sure. Peter tells me they're not required to, but I do know that they have to swear an oath, which includes swearing to the Queen rather than to the people of Australia. So that's definitely something that should be changed.
My question's related to the how the Greens handles their publicity in public. I've noticed when returning senators have been on Q&A this year, Larissa Walters on one issue and Sarah Hanson-Young on another issue, because of the structure of the debate, they weren't prepared to state the bleeding obvious. So when the issue of economics came up, and the whole debate was framed within the federal budget, deficit or not deficit, and cuts or no cuts. And I think the senator in question, I think it was Sarah in that case, let the ball go through to the keeper and say, yes, but what about the Panama Papers? Yes, but what about the multinationals not paying any tax? And because of the structure of the debates, the Greens don't point out the obvious thing, that their vote in the last federal election went up because all the attention was on the Pauline Hanson and Nick Senapue raging vote. And I noticed in the media, in the post-election analysis, they didn't even include the Greens' vote, the fact that it had gone up quite considerably over the last federal election. So what I'm really driving at is, how can the Greens maintain confidence in the fact that they're always under media attack, and any, even internal debates over who should get pre-selection or shadow portfolios or whatever, with Sarah Hanson-Young recently being shifted out of the refugee thing. The Greens are always presented in a negative light. is there any way that a PR campaign can be arranged internally so that they can project themselves as reflecting the strength that they actually do have?
Thank you for that question. It's an interesting one. Generally, the whole concept of PR makes me shudder, but I think my experience in Wollongong has been that just being part of the grassroots community movement is a fantastic way to gain community support. So basic things that are about getting out in the community and meeting people. In Wollongong, a lot of people tend to vote for the way their parents vote. There's generation of stuck in the way people vote, and there's long existing prejudice against the Greens. But I think I don't have any magic solutions. If someone does, I'd love to hear them. But I think we just have to keep getting involved in community campaigns, being part of doing the graft, of making positive change happen.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate our speaker tonight. I think that was a virtuoso performance. You covered just so, with little notice, you covered so many issues at such depth. I do hope you'll be running again for Parliament. Are you? That's my first question.
Well,
my brother lives
yes.
in Wollongong, yeah.
Well, then you'd know that there's an election coming up very soon. We were thinking, it wouldn't be till 2019, but Noreen Hayes stepped down.
Good.
With one of her chief of staff being charged with electoral fraud. So we've got an election sooner than we thought. And the Labor Party chose Luke Foley has already chosen the candidate. So the local branches of the ALP haven't been able to democratically pick a candidate.
We do this meeting every Thursday night, and we are very even-handed as far as the left is concerned about having ALP speakers and Green speakers according to the portfolios. What has personally been upsetting for me as someone who works, for us, for the politics of the Parliament, has been the attitude of the Labor speakers towards the Greens. Not when the Greens are present, although half the audience is Green. They are very personal. They are very personal in the way they attack the Greens. And we did have a guy called Peter, the guy who's a Labor member for something in the Wollongong area. And he spent most of his time just attacking the Greens. So what I want to know is, I understand the Sydney situation, but what's the relationship like in the Wollongong area between, first of all, the power people in Labor down there and the Greens, and just ordinary sort of branch members of both Greens? What's it like? It's very toxic humour in Sydney. What's it like in Wollongong?
It depends. It depends on if they're old Labor or... at the polling booth before the federal election, I was using it as an opportunity to talk to all the people from the Labor Party that were handing out for the Labor Party to make sure that they were going to come to the refugee rally that we had on the 25th of June. And everyone I spoke to said yes, that they would be there. So that's promising. And I guess partly Sharon Bird probably didn't feel that threatened by me. She didn't get elected the first time she ran because Michael Morgan, the Greens candidate, he won. We've always been cordial and friendly, and I like to think that we should focus on policy rather than getting personal. But I haven't had much to do with maybe the heavyweights of the Labor Party, but that's partly because the community groups and action groups that I'm part of, they're not in. So we did have a Liberal council that asked if he could come along to the Refugee Action Collective, and we discussed it, and we pointed out that he was part of a political party whose policies we opposed, and that we thought he should act to change that party policy, but that he was welcome to attend if he was happy to support the closure of offshore detention centres and bringing the refugees to Australia. He never came to a meeting, unfortunately.
The next question, please. Charlie Bradley. It's a longer question than usual, though my last one was fairly long too. I want to acknowledge that I'm a member of the local branch of the Australian Labor Party for this area. I also want to acknowledge that I believe the processes, the democratic processes that we're operating under are currently broken. So representative democracy is seriously under threat and circumscribed. So the way in which the Parliament works is subverted by the press and the sets of relationships. Cutting across it, of course, is the decline in the media and the rearrangements of the way news is going to come through. There are a range of disruptions which I'll list in, but this presentation has become prospects for the Greens rather than prospects for Australia. And part of the prospects for Australia are going to be met by the Greens and other progressives working together. And you've been describing that, and you're an excellent example of that sort of operation. And you're not afraid of what's to come, but there is a lot of disruption to come. We do have to reshape our democracy. So there's digital disruption that is referred to. The limits to growth have already caused a great deal of distress, and of course the emerging economies are the ones that are held back most of all. Global warming migration is going to be greater than the migration from Syria. What it leads to, of course, is there is a need for greater discussion at this level, so at the level of politics in the pub. But also, and it was marvellous to hear you talk about it, the sort of activity that you've been engaged with in Wollongong. What I'm getting at is that we're going to have to work hard on getting those changes to take place. And could you comment more about the way, I mean, you've done a pretty good job already, but could you comment a little bit more about the sorts of coming together that you're experiencing? I was going to talk about your local Labor member. Oh, look, I will just throw that in, please, Chair. Your local member for the state parliament can say, we'll do everything we can for Wollongong. But what's the position of the Labor member in Canberra? Because if the Labor Party comes to government, it's going to be held to account to all of these free trade agreements, which circumscribe, I mean, they really are an attack on our democratic sovereignty. And these are the things that progressives are going to have to work with together to deal with. Say a little bit more about those activities.
Thanks, Charlie. I share the hope that I think progressives need to work together, and it's great that in the Illawarra, I guess in a way we're a smaller community, so we have to. But one of the Trans-Pacific partnerships and the free trade agreements were an issue that the Liberal Party raised in defending their opposition to steel procurement. But they couldn't name a single clause that it was going to offend. So it was all just based on ideology. It wasn't actually based on any fact. And I mean, the Twin Towers disaster happened in 2001, but a year before that, an exact year before, we had S11, and I was 20 at the time. It was the first big mobilisation that I ever participated in, and it was just the protest against the World Economic Forum down in Melbourne, where we had unionists and environmentalists and students and so many other people from all across the country, everyone said that if you wanted to rob a bank in Victoria, that was the week to do it, because all the police were around the Crown Casino. So I think we've had that kind of cross community action before, and we're seeing it with the Stop Coal Seam Gas and the Lock the Gate movement, where we're seeing farmers and environmentalists and Indigenous activists all working together to protect country. So I think that definitely we can have more cross-party support, and I hope that the Labor Party is part of it, but I can't speak for them being part of it until we see.
Well, I can.
Oh yeah, it's excellent.
That doesn't mean the members of Parliament.
That's right. And I think part of that reform that needs to happen to make representative democracy more effective in Australia is cleaning up the donations. And we've seen news about that this week with the ICAC report coming out and revealing some disgusting corruption and people making decisions that aren't in the best interest of the state, that are just about their own personal wealth. And we also see it as systemically kind of part of the system of the revolving door between ministries and then very cushy positions. So the Greens have a whole bunch of reforms proposed that it would be, that, you know, the reason that we've had this situation in New South Wales where the Liberal Party now has $4 million withheld in electoral funding because they've broken the electoral disclosure requirements, is because we had support, cross-party support to make sure that the donations were laws were tightened up so that you couldn't get donations from property developers. And so we need to see that happen, I think, with the fossil fuel industry, because at the moment what the fossil fuel industry spend on political donations, they get back so much greater. Well, not 100-fold. I have remembered this. I can't remember what the statistic is, but they get it back in subsidies and it's really twisting our political situation. And I do share the great concern about how the impact of climate change will impact on people around the world. I was part of the People's Parliament down in Canberra in December last year, when the negotiations were happening in Paris, and there was people from all over the country. There was Aboriginal elders from Gladstone, people from Tuvalu, people of faith and farmers and all sorts of people, and it was a very moving event to be part of such a broad group. I'm an atheist myself. I hadn't experienced that situation with the people of faith who were holding kind of communion in the People's Parliament that we held. So I think that those alliances are happening, and we can it would do us all well to keep building them.
Bruce Toms, I'm retired now, and before I retired I had some responsibility for TAFE in the Illawarra region, and in those days neoliberalism hadn't crept in so much as it has since, and which means privatising everything that moves. So in an important manufacturing region like Port Kembla, Wollongong, you just can't afford to mess about with the TAFE system in the way that it's gone on in so many other places. How much damage has been done down there, and what campaigns are going on to remedy the situation?
Yeah, the situation with TAFE in Wollongong is dire. We've, like you probably heard that the Dapto campus is closed, and there's been big cuts. Like I was talking to one teacher who they had 1,000 students, and now it's in the tens of students. There's been and as you would be aware, there's students are ending up enrolling in private vocational education and training that don't have qualifications worth anything. They're ending up in debt with it, and the public purse pays for that. So we've seen the TAFE campaign in Wollongong wasn't that strong during the federal election because most of the focus was down in Gilmore, where it was a Liberal held seat, and the majority, the vote for the Liberals did fall, but not enough. So unfortunately it's still a Liberal seat. But we have had, the reason that TAFE funding is being lost, VET funding is being lost from the public system, is because it was the Gillard government that set up the system where you could have contestable funding, that the dollars would follow the student and could go to a private training organisation. And so we've seen private training organisations offer courses that are cheap, and there's been controversy after controversy of enticements used and free laptops and iPads and lack of disclosure about the debt that students are getting into. And on top of that, we've had the total sham of the enrolment system, where people just haven't been able to enrol, and the increase in costs in TAFE. So it's something that we campaigned on. We got some backlash about it from people. One person in particular, who's an ex-TAFE teacher, who went and set up a private training organisation. So, but there's a lot of community concern about that, about TAFE, because it's getting access to education. It's a real leveller. It can really help, people change their lives and help themselves. And I went to university, but there was a time when I dropped out for a year and I went to TAFE, and it was TAFE that got me inspired to learning again and taught me practical skills so that I had a trade doing bush regen that paid my way for the rest of uni. So TAFE, and even the tightening of you can only get one TAFE course, or you can only, and that's happening with university too, the tightening of education funding, it's going to have big impacts. And I share your concerns. And we've got some great TAFE activists in Wollongong, but definitely I think it's going to get a lot more attention with the by-election coming up.
Oh, Dave Jenkins. Going back to the steel making, I can remember in the 60s when BHP was accused by the Americans of dumping steel in America. I don't know whether they actually did. I think they were still making a profit, but they had a very efficient company. BHP was one of the best steel makers in the world. And as an example, a few years later, BHP was asked to help Iran build a steel plant. And, the Americans put a veto on that idea, so we missed out on that. But I suppose you can take this as a comment rather than a question. But that's all that knowledge. I don't know, is it all just drifting away to nothing?
My dad, when he retired from the steelworks, he said that there were things that he did that didn't get, like that knowledge was lost from the company. But so there's a lot more being contracted out. But also BlueScope is a multinational company these days. It's just finished a takeover of a very profitable steel making factory in the States. And it's no longer part of BHP, so it's been separated. So they have to pay for minerals or ingredients, as I used to call them as a kid, when I considered my dad as a steel chef. They have to pay for them on the open market. So it's a different situation for that BlueScope is operating in now.
Don Sutherland, my question is also about the tensions between the Greens and Labor and I want to preface it with just a couple of comments though. I think the way in which the Greens have moved in regard to steel making in Wollongong is really terrific, and I think that's quite a positive and promising thing, because I think the big weakness, and still is really the big weakness in the Greens' position in regard to climate change, is a transition that is based upon jobs being equal to the environment in the whole development of the transition. I don't think that spreads widely enough. At the same time, I think to the puny extent that they do, those in the ALP don't grasp, or do grasp something about the meaning of jobs in some crude way, often quite puny, and they are dragging the chain certainly on the need for very rapid transition. Climate change, there's an enormous urgency for the transition to escalate, speed up, both quantitatively and qualitatively. What I'm therefore going to ask you about is what sort of discussions are going on in the Greens about how initiatives might develop to build a rapprochement with people of like mind in the ALP. I'm not just thinking about ALP politicians, but of the rank and file of the ALP. Thank you.
During the federal election campaign, Michael Osborne from Newcastle came down to Wollongong. He was the number 2 Senate candidate. Unfortunately, he didn't get elected, but we discussed the transition that Newcastle went through with the closure of the steelworks there, and how 7 years before that was happening, there was all sorts of initiatives put in place so that people could transition out of those steelworks jobs. And I know in Wollongong we had a whole bunch of people move to the Gong to work from Newcastle because of that, but also people got the opportunity to retrain on company time. And in Wollongong we had some federally funded research project called Green Jobs Illawarra that was really pushed by the Labor Council and involved the Regional Development Authority and the university. And Wollongong University has always had a big engineering focus with BHP. But unfortunately, when there was a change of federal government, that was just sidelined. They didn't want anything with green in the title, and there was even BlueScope had plans for a cogeneration plant. They were fully costed. They had the site, but I guess the downturn, the global financial crisis, as well as the removal of the carbon tax, meant that there wasn't any incentive to invest in that kind of cutting edge, cleaner technology. So, I definitely think there's scope of working together, and I feel like the Steel campaign has helped. It has been part of helping that happen, and it's going to be interesting what happens with the local, some of the local mining issues where we're seeing foreign-owned mining companies close down and then reopen with contract workers. That's getting a lot of attention in Wollongong at the moment as well. So how union and climate and water and all these issues are kind of often interact and
Yes, I'm Joffrey Bouch. I'm in the organizing committee of the Politics in the Pub and the secretary of the Association for Good Government. And my question is in relation to my perceptions that the opposition, the Greens, Labour, seem to be very reactive with regard to policy debates. And in terms of that reaction, what are produced instead is just a simple opposition. But what I see is lacking is a framework that challenges the very frameworks of neoliberal capitalism. Because the reaction still, as I perceive, tries to preserve the framework that neoliberal capitalism proposes. That deficits are a problem. That when in fact the taxation system itself violates every principle of taxation that begins in every taxation textbook. So my question really is, has the Greens been studying a framework by which to challenge the very framework of neoliberal capitalism? So instead of being reactive in the framework of neoliberal capitalism, actually challenges neoliberal capitalism itself and proposes really radical policies, lasting solutions.
The Greens is a grassroots parliamentary party, so there's lots of working groups, and there's an economics working group that I'm not on top of everything that they've been working on. But generally the Greens has the 4 basic principles of grassroots democracy, non-violence, economic sustainability, economic justice and ecological sustainability. And for me as a candidate, I've found that actually a beautiful part of just that being my touchstone, you know, that if I'm considering any issue to talk on, then I can look back at those principles and that provides a vision for the way forward. We've got quite a wide gamut of people that are involved, and so for example on budget night we had Frank Stilwell and Raywin Connell give us a debrief on the impact of the budget. So that's a reactionary action, but it's within a Greens framework that we got to analyse those decisions with. And it is hard it can be hard to shift the agenda. Like climate change is something that I'm deeply concerned about, but we had very little media interest when we did climate change events. We had a beautiful community event, which was very unusual, where we had a climate scientist and an atmospheric chemist and a public health climate science academic and myself talk about climate change, and then we had some actors take the audience through the emotional responses to them. And so even though we haven't had any media on that, we had this wonderful community event that I felt shifted people's attitudes and fear that can be paralysing about the issue. So there's working groups that happen in the Greens to develop our economic policy and our economic literacy, but there's also and allies in the community that we look to as well.
Tom, you want one more go?
There's a sort of a connection between what Joffrey was raising and what I was raising. I think one of the ironies of the tensions between Greens and Labor, using small g and small l, is that there is the dominant paradigm in both policy settings is the market. And that's not to say there are not other aspects to the policy that are not necessarily market, but the primacy in both policy settings is this faith in the market. And that reflects the cancer of neoliberalism in both parties. In Labor I'd call it neoliberalism, but in the Greens I'm not sure what I'd call it. But I think that is a policy problem, generally, for all of us, not just those who are in the parties and so on. That is a policy problem. That this primacy upon the price of carbon being the dominant sort of theme in setting policy. And I think that's what Joffrey was trying to get at as well, that there is sort of this reactive thing where everything that is done is built around something that's imposed upon us by the dynamic of the system. We've got to try and break out of that, I think. And the first signs, as I say, I think is what you're trying to do around steel policy. I think there are promising signs of that.
I think it's interesting, the whole issue of trading anything, how that neoliberal attitude is being translated into all sorts of areas. We've seen it in the Murray with water trade license being traded, and we're seeing it in biodiversity with the whole concept of offsets. And they're massively problematic. We know that when it comes to biodiversity offsetting, there's never this like for like you can't clear one forest and protect the species that live in another one. It's I've heard it likened to back in the old days of Catholic indulgences, where you just do it anyway. And
Commit a sin.
yeah. So yeah, I do take your point that there's a whole framework that's quite insidious, and shifting that is, I feel like it's happening around the world with we've got more and more criticisms of neoliberalism, and it's been really interesting the way it's come from the States with and across Europe, where they really felt the global financial crisis. We were quite insulated from it here in Australia, and so in some of the other parts of the Western world, it's opened up space to reevaluate what's really important in the community. Because, I mean, as an environmental scientist, by training, in the Greens, there's an environmental saying that there's no jobs on a dead planet. But actually, GDP goes up when there's an environmental disaster and a crisis, because we employ people to clean it up or whatever, because it doesn't necessarily take into account all the costs. So I definitely think that looking to other ways of calculating wealth and worth are really important.
We've really come to the end of our time. It's remarkable. I really think we should give a great vote of thanks to Kath Blakey for her contributions tonight.